The red sun of Velterran was setting behind the massive stone walls of the city. Doctor, Sarah Chen walked carefully through the narrow streets, her small human frame moving between the giant Kethmari, who lived there. These lion-like aliens stood 3 times taller than her, their golden fur shining in the evening light. Their deep voices rumbled like thunder when they spoke. Sarah had been studying on this planet for 2 years now. She was a scientist who wanted to learn about how the Kethmari had babies. Her research was important for understanding how different species could live together in peace. But she never expected what would happen today. The sound of drums filled the air. Sarah knew what this meant. It was the season of new life. When new cubs were born, the whole city would celebrate if the cubs were strong and healthy. But something felt different today. The drums sounded sad instead of happy. Sarah followed the crowd toward the great palace. The Kethmari around her whispered in worried voices. Their ears were flat against their heads, which meant they were upset. Sarah had learned to read their body language during her time here. The High Matriarch has given birth, said a deep voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Jorvek, one of the few Kethmari who would talk to her. He was smaller than most of his kind, only 10 feet tall, instead of the usual 12 or 15 feet. That should be good news, Sarah said. Why does everyone look so worried? Jorvek's golden eyes looked sad. 3 cubs were born. But they are wrong. They are too small. Much too small. Sarah felt her heart sink. She knew what happened to cubs that were born different among the Kethmari. Their culture believed that only the strongest should survive. Cubs that were weak or sick were left in the desert to die. It was an old law that nobody questioned. The crowd moved toward the city gates. Sarah saw High Commander Thaxul walking ahead of them. He was the father of the cubs, and one of the most feared warriors on the planet. His massive form stood 15 feet tall, with scars covering his arms from many battles. But today he looked broken. In his arms, he carried a small basket. Sarah could barely see 3 tiny forms inside it. The cubs were so small, they could fit in one of Thaxul's hands. They looked like house cats compared to the giant lions around them. By the ancient laws, Thaxul said in a voice that shook with pain, these cubs cannot carry our blood. They would bring shame to our family. They must be given to the desert. The crowd followed him through the gates and into the crimson wastes. This was the desert that surrounded their city. It was called Crimson because the sand was red like blood. Nothing lived there except dangerous creatures and poisonous plants. Sarah watched in horror as Thaxul placed the basket on the hot sand. The tiny cubs inside were crying, but their voices were so weak that only Sarah could hear them. The Kethmari's ears were too big to pick up such soft sounds. The desert will decide their fate, said the High Matriarch. She was Thaxul's mate and the mother of the cubs. Tears ran down her furry cheeks, but she did not try to stop what was happening. If they are meant to live, they will find a way. The crowd began to leave. Thaxul stood looking at the basket for a long time. His huge hands were shaking. Then he turned and walked away with the others. Sarah stayed hidden behind a large rock. She waited until all the Kethmari were gone. Then she ran to the basket. The 3 cubs inside were barely breathing. Their fur was soft and golden like their parents. But their bodies were so tiny, they looked like they might die at any moment. I can't let this happen, Sarah whispered. She picked up the basket carefully. The cubs were so light that they felt like feathers in her hands. Sarah knew she was breaking the law. If the Kethmari found out what she was doing, they would be very angry. They might send her away from the planet, or worse, they might kill her for interfering with their ways. But Sarah could not watch innocent babies die. She had become a scientist because she wanted to help all living creatures. That included these tiny cubs, who had done nothing wrong, except be born different. She carried the basket back to her research station outside the city. It was a small building where she kept her computers and equipment. The Kethmari government had given her permission to use it for her studies. Sarah set up a warm bed for the cubs using soft blankets. She gave them milk from a bottle, drop by drop. Their mouths were so small that they could barely swallow. She stayed awake all night watching them breathe. The smallest cub had white markings on his chest. Sarah decided to call him Zirak, which meant brave heart in the Kethmari language. The female cub had bright green eyes, so Sarah named her Nissa, meaning bright star. The third cub was completely golden and seemed to be the strongest, so she called him Corvain, which meant golden hope. Over the next few days, Sarah took care of the cubs like they were her own children. She fed them every few hours and kept them warm. Slowly, they began to get stronger. Their eyes opened, and they started to make small sounds when they were hungry. Sarah noticed something interesting about the cubs. They were much more alert than normal Kethmari babies should be at their age. When she moved around the room, their eyes followed her. When she spoke, they turned their heads toward her voice. They seemed to understand things that other cubs their age could not. But Sarah also knew she could not keep them secret forever. The Kethmari would eventually find out what she had done. When that happened, she would need to have a plan to protect them. As she watched the 3 tiny cubs sleeping peacefully in their warm bed, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would prove that being different did not mean being weak. She would show the Kethmari that these cubs had just as much right to live as anyone else. The red sun was rising again over Velterran. Soon, Sarah's real challenge would begin. 3 weeks passed since Sarah had rescued the cubs. They were growing stronger every day, but they were still much smaller than normal Kethmari cubs their age. Sarah spent most of her time studying them and taking care of them. During the day, she would do her regular research work. She would take samples and write reports about Kethmari biology. But at night, she would play with the cubs and watch how they learned about the world around them. Sarah discovered something amazing. The cubs were much smarter than they should be. Normal Kethmari cubs could barely walk at this age, but Zirak, Nissa, and Corvain were already solving simple puzzles. They could figure out how to open food containers and how to climb up to high places. "You 3 are special," Sarah would tell them as they played. "You just need someone to believe in you." Sarah ran tests on their blood and found the reason for their small size. They had a rare genetic change that made their bodies smaller, but their brains bigger. This change happened in only 1 out of every million births. Instead of being weak, they were actually more advanced than other cubs. Their reflexes were faster too. When Sarah would drop something by accident, the cubs would move out of the way before it hit the ground. Their small bodies could move much quicker than the heavy forms of normal Kethmari, but keeping the cubs secret was getting harder. Sarah's research partner, Dr. Marcus Webb, was starting to ask questions about why she was spending so much time at the lab. "You're working too many late nights, Sarah," Marcus said one morning. He was a tall human man with gray hair who had been studying alien cultures for many years. "What's keeping you so busy?" "Just extra research," Sarah lied. She hated not telling the truth, but she had to protect the cubs. Marcus looked at her with worried eyes. "I hope you're not doing anything that could get us in trouble with the Kethmari government. They don't like it when outsiders interfere with their ways." Sarah nodded and tried to look calm. But inside, she was very nervous. She knew that what she was doing was dangerous. That afternoon, while Sarah was in the city buying food, disaster struck. A group of Kethmari soldiers came to inspect her research station. They were looking for signs that humans were breaking any laws. The cubs were now big enough to make noise. When the soldiers entered the lab, Zirak, Nissa, and Corvain started crying because they were scared of the strangers. The soldiers heard the sounds and followed them to where Sarah had hidden the cubs. "What is this?" roared Captain Vorthok, the leader of the soldiers. He was a massive Kethmari with black stripes on his golden fur. His eyes went wide when he saw the 3 small cubs. "These are the forsaken runts that were given to the desert," said another soldier. "The human has stolen them." When Sarah returned to her lab, she found the soldiers waiting for her. The cubs were in a metal cage, crying and trying to reach for her through the bars. Sarah's heart broke when she saw how scared they were. "Dr. Sarah Chen," Captain Vorthak said in a voice like rolling thunder, "you are under arrest for crimes against the natural order. You have corrupted the sacred law of the desert trial." Heavy metal chains were put around Sarah's wrists. The chains were made for Kethmari prisoners, and were much too big for her. But they were still too heavy for her to break. "Please don't hurt them," Sarah begged. "They're just babies. They haven't done anything wrong. They should have died in the desert," Vorthok said. "By saving them, you have upset the balance of nature. Now, they must face the consequences." Sarah was dragged to the great palace and thrown into a dark cell. The walls were made of stone, and there were no windows. She could hear the cubs crying somewhere far away, but she could not reach them. Hours later, the cell door opened. High Commander Thaxul stepped inside. Up close, he looked even more frightening than before. His yellow eyes glowed in the darkness like fire. "Why?" he asked in a voice full of pain. "Why did you save them? They would have died peacefully in the desert. Now they will suffer before their execution." Sarah stood up and looked directly into his eyes. She was not afraid anymore. She was angry. "Because every life has value," she said. "Your cubs are not weak. They are different, and that makes them special." Thaxul laughed bitterly. "Look at them. They are the size of house pets. They could never be warriors. They could never bring honor to our family." "Have you actually spent time with them?" Sarah asked. "Have you watched how they think and learn? They are smarter than any Kethmari cub I have ever seen. Intelligence without strength is useless." Thaxul said. "Our world is dangerous. Only the strong survive." Quote, Sarah took a deep breath. She had an idea that was either very brave or very stupid. "Give me a chance to prove you wrong," she said. "Let me show the Council of Elders what your cubs can really do." Thaxul's ears moved forward with surprise. "What are you suggesting?" "A trial," Sarah said. "Not a trial to punish me, but a trial to test the cubs. If they fail, I will accept whatever punishment you choose, but if they succeed, you must accept them back into your family." Thaxul stared at her for a long time. Outside the cell, Sarah could hear the sounds of the city at night. The Kethmari were going about their lives while 3 innocent cubs waited to die. "What kind of trial?" Thaxul finally asked. "Your people value strength, hunting skills, and tactical thinking," Sarah said. "Test the cubs in these areas. But let them do it their own way. Not the traditional Kethmari way." "The council will never agree to this," Thaxul said. "Then make them agree," Sarah replied. "You are their father. You have the right to request a trial by merit instead of execution." Thaxul was quiet for several minutes. Sarah could see him thinking hard about her words. "The trials would be dangerous," he said finally. "The cubs could die." "They're going to die anyway if we don't try," Sarah pointed out. "At least this way, they have a chance." Thaxul nodded slowly. "I will speak to the council. But if they agree and the cubs fail, you will watch them die before you are executed yourself." "I understand," Sarah said. As Thaxul left the cell, Sarah sat down on the cold stone floor. She had just bet everything on 3 tiny cubs that most people thought were worthless. But she believed in them. She had seen their potential, and she knew they could surprise everyone. Now she just had to hope that the council would give them a chance to prove it. The Council of Elders met in the great stone hall at the center of the palace. 12 ancient Kethmari sat on high chairs carved from black rock. Their fur was white with age, and their eyes held the wisdom of many years. Sarah had never seen such impressive creatures before. Elder Korvash, the oldest of them all, spoke first. His voice was like wind through mountain caves. "High Commander Thaxul has made an unusual request," he said. "He wishes to test the forsaken cubs before they are executed. This goes against our ancient ways." "The human claims they have special abilities," said another elder. "She says their small size makes them stronger, not weaker." The elders talked among themselves in low voices. Sarah could not understand all their words, but she could tell they were not happy about the idea. Elder Korvash looked down at Sarah from his high chair. "Human scientist, you have broken our sacred laws. Why should we listen to anything you say?" Sarah stood up straight and spoke clearly. "Because truth is more important than tradition. Your laws were made to protect the strong, but what if you have been throwing away your greatest treasures?" "Explain yourself," Korvash demanded. "In human history, Some of our greatest leaders were people that others thought were weak, Sarah said. We had a scientist who could barely walk, but his mind unlocked the secrets of the universe. We had leaders who were smaller than their enemies, but they won wars through cleverness instead of strength. The elders listened carefully. The Kethmari respected stories of great deeds, even from other species. What trials do you propose? Asked Elder Marana, the only female on the council. Thaxul stepped forward. 3 trials, as is traditional. First, the trial of the hunt, to test their survival skills. Second, the trial of war, to test their tactical minds. Third, the trial of spirit, to test their courage against a real enemy. And if they fail? Korvash asked. Then we accept their execution, Sarah said, though the words hurt to speak. But if they succeed, they must be accepted as true Kethmari, worthy of life and honor. After much discussion, the council agreed. The trials would begin the next morning. That night, Sarah was allowed to see the cubs one last time. They were being kept in a small room with soft beds and plenty of food. When Sarah entered, they ran to her on their small legs. Sarah, Nissa cried in her tiny voice. The cubs had learned to speak some human words during their time with her. Hello, little ones, Sarah said, kneeling down to hug them. They were still much smaller than normal Kethmari cubs, but they had grown stronger over the past weeks. Are we in trouble? Asked Zirak. His white chest markings had grown brighter as he got older. You have to show everyone how smart and brave you are, Sarah explained. Tomorrow there will be some games, like puzzles and challenges. Can you do that for me? We're good at puzzles, said Corvain confidently. His golden fur shone in the lamplight. Sarah spent the night teaching them what to expect. She could not help them during the trials, but she could prepare them for what was coming. The next morning, a huge crowd gathered in the training grounds outside the city. Word had spread about the unusual trial, and Kethmari came from far away to watch. Some were curious, but many were angry that the sacred laws were being questioned. The first trial was called the Hunt. It was not a hunt for real animals, but a test of survival skills using an ancient maze. The maze was built underground and filled with traps, puzzles, and hidden paths. Normal Kethmari cubs would not face this trial until they were much older and bigger. The cubs must reach the center of the maze and bring back the golden claw, announced Elder Korvash. They have 1 hour. If they fail to return in time, they fail the trial. The entrance to the maze was a dark hole in the ground. Steps led down into blackness. Sarah watched nervously as the 3 tiny cubs stood at the edge. We can do this, Zarak whispered to his siblings. Remember what Sarah taught us. The cubs disappeared into the darkness. Sarah could only wait and hope. Inside the maze, the cubs found themselves in a narrow tunnel. The walls were made of stone and covered with strange markings. Most Kethmari would try to break through the walls with strength, but the cubs were too small for that. Instead, they studied the markings carefully. Nissa, who had always been good with patterns, noticed that some symbols were repeated. Look, she said, pointing with her small paw. These marks show which way to go. Following the symbols, they avoided several traps that would have caught larger creatures. When they reached a pit that was too wide to jump across, they used their small size to climb along narrow ledges that bigger Kethmari could not use. Above ground, the crowd was getting restless. Many Kethmari thought the cubs had already died in the maze. This is taking too long, grumbled one warrior. Normal cubs would have reached the center by now. Or died trying, said another. Sarah looked at the sun. 40 minutes had passed. She was starting to worry, but just then, the cubs appeared at the maze entrance. Zarak was carrying a golden statue shaped like a claw. All 3 cubs were dirty, but unharmed. The crowd went silent with surprise. No Kethmari cubs had ever completed the hunt trial so quickly. How did you do it? Asked Captain Vorthok, who had been watching from the crowd. We didn't fight the maze, Corvain explained. We listened to it. The walls told us where to go. Elder Marana looked impressed. What do you mean? The old builders left clues, Nissa said. Pictures on the walls. We just had to be small enough to see them up close. This was true. The ancient symbols had been carved very small, too small for normal-sized Kethmari to notice. But the cubs' small heads could get close enough to read them clearly. "Clever," admitted Thaxul quietly. Sarah saw something new in his eyes when he looked at his cubs. Was it pride? The second trial began immediately. This was the trial of war, where the cubs had to plan a battle strategy. They were given toy armies and a map of a pretend battlefield. The challenge was to defeat an enemy army that was 3 times larger than their own. Most Kethmari solved this by charging straight at the enemy with maximum force. But the cubs had a different idea. "We're smaller, so we should be faster," Zirak said, moving his toy soldiers carefully. "And we can hide in places the big army can't go," added Nissa. They created a plan using small groups of soldiers to attack from many directions at once. While the enemy was confused, the main force would attack their supply lines and cut off their food and weapons. The Kethmari war chiefs who were judging this trial had never seen such a strategy. It was completely different from traditional tactics, but it was very smart. "This could actually work," admitted War Chief Gorak, a huge Kethmari with many battle scars. "They're thinking like hunters, not warriors. Is that good or bad?" Sarah asked nervously. "In war, winning is what matters," Gorak replied. "These cubs understand that better than most of my adult soldiers." The cubs had passed 2 trials, but the hardest one was still coming. The trial of spirit would test not just their minds, but their courage. And for that trial, they would face a real, living monster. The final trial would take place in the Arena of Courage, a massive circle surrounded by tall stone walls. The arena was as big as 3 football fields, with rocky ground and large boulders scattered around. This was where young Kethmari proved they were brave enough to become adults. Sarah sat in the viewing area with the elders and other important Kethmari. Her hands were shaking as she watched the cubs being led into the arena. They looked so tiny in that huge space. "For the trial of spirit," Elder Korvash announced, "the cubs must face a Skarbeth." Gasps came from the crowd. Even Sarah, who had studied many dangerous creatures on this planet, felt her heart stop. The Skarbeth was one of the most feared predators on Velterran. It was like a giant lizard with 6 legs, sharp teeth, and skin harder than metal. Full-grown Kethmari warriors sometimes died fighting these monsters. "That's not fair," Sarah said, standing up from her seat. "They're just babies. The trial must be meaningful," replied Elder Korvash. "If they cannot face true danger, they cannot be considered worthy of life among us." Thaxul looked pale as he watched his cubs in the arena. Sarah could see that he was starting to regret agreeing to this trial. But it was too late to stop now. A large metal gate opened on the far side of the arena. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the dark tunnel beyond. Then the Skarbeth appeared. It was huge. Its body was 20 feet long and covered in green scales that sparkled in the sunlight. Its 6 legs ended in claws as long as swords. When it opened its mouth, rows of teeth gleamed like white daggers. The Skarbeth saw the 3 small cubs and let out a roar that shook the ground. It was probably confused about why such tiny creatures were in its arena. Usually, it fought large warriors who could give it a real challenge. "Stay together," Zirak whispered to his siblings. "Remember what Sarah taught us about teamwork." The monster charged toward them, moving faster than something so big should be able to move. Most Kethmari would stand their ground and try to fight it head-on. But the cubs scattered in 3 different directions. The Skarbeth was confused. It had been expecting 1 target to chase, not 3. It stopped and looked around, trying to decide which cub to attack first. This was exactly what the cubs had planned. While the monster was confused, Nissa ran behind it and started making loud noises. The Skarbeth spun around to chase her, but she was too fast and too small. She darted between its legs and hid behind a boulder. Meanwhile, Corvain climbed up on top of a large rock. When the Skarbeth turned to look for Nissa, Corvain jumped down and landed on the monster's back. His claws were tiny compared to the creature's thick scales, but he knew where to strike. Kethmari cubs were taught about the weak spots of different predators. Corvain remembered that Skarbeths had sensitive nerve clusters just behind their heads. He scratched at that spot as hard as he could. The monster roared in pain and tried to shake him off. While it was distracted, Zarak ran in from the side and bit down on one of its back legs. His teeth were small, but he aimed for the soft spot between the scales. The crowd was amazed. They had never seen anything like this before. Usually, warriors tried to kill the Skarbeth with brute force, using big weapons and strong armor. But the cubs were using speed, teamwork, and knowledge instead of strength. "They're hunting it like a pack," Warchief Gorak said with wonder. "They're treating it like prey, instead of trying to fight it like an equal." Sarah felt a spark of hope. The cubs were not just surviving. They were winning. The Skarbeth was getting angrier and more confused. Every time it tried to attack one cub, the other two would attack it from behind. Its thick skin protected it from serious harm, but the constant small attacks were wearing it down. "Now!" Zarak shouted to his siblings. All three cubs ran toward the center of the arena, where there was a deep pit that was usually covered by a metal grate. The grate had been removed for this trial. The cubs jumped over the pit easily because they were so light, but they knew the heavy Skarbeth could not stop in time. The monster charged after them, blinded by anger. Just as the cubs had hoped, it could not stop before reaching the pit. Its weight carried it forward, and it fell into the deep hole with a tremendous crash. The arena went completely silent. The Skarbeth was not dead, but it was trapped. It roared and clawed at the walls of the pit, but it could not climb out. The cubs had won without killing their opponent. This was something that had never happened in the history of the arena. "Impossible," breathed Captain Vorthak. "No one has ever defeated a Skarbeth without weapons." "They did not defeat it through strength," Elder Marana observed. "They used intelligence, speed, and cooperation. They turned their small size into an advantage." Thaxul was staring at his cubs with an expression Sarah had never seen on a Kethmari face before. His eyes were wide with amazement, and his ears were pointed forward with excitement. "My cubs," he whispered. "My clever, brave cubs." In the arena, the three cubs stood together near the edge of the pit. They were tired, but proud. They had faced the most dangerous creature on their planet, and won. Elder Korvash stood up slowly. His ancient voice carried across the arena so everyone could hear. "The trials are complete," he announced. "The cubs have proven their worth in all three challenges. They have shown skills in survival, strategy, and courage. They have succeeded not by being what we expected, but by being what they truly are." The crowd began to cheer. Not everyone was happy about the results, but most Kethmari respected courage and cleverness when they saw it. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. The cubs had done it. They had proven that being different did not mean being weak, but the real test was still coming. Now the elders had to decide what this meant for the cubs' future. Would they be accepted back into Kethmari society? Or would the council find some other reason to reject them? Thaxul jumped down into the arena and ran to his cubs. For the first time in their lives, their father picked them up and held them close. "I am proud of you," he said in a voice full of emotion. "You have shown me that strength comes in many forms." The cubs looked up at their father with joy. They had not only survived the trials, they had won back their family. But Sarah knew that their real challenge was just beginning. Now they had to change an entire society's way of thinking. And that might be the hardest trial of all. The Council of Elders met again that evening to discuss what had happened. The Great Hall was filled with more Kethmari than usual. Word of the cubs' victory had spread throughout the city, and everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Sarah sat quietly in the corner, still wearing the chains on her wrists. Even though the cubs had passed their trials, she was not sure if the elders would keep their promise. Sometimes, even when people were proven wrong, they still refused to change their minds. Elder Korvash spoke first, his ancient voice echoing through the hall. "We have witnessed something unprecedented today. 3 cubs who should have died in the desert have not only survived, but excelled in trials that challenge even our strongest warriors. The question before us is simple. said Elder Marana. Do we honor our agreement? Or do we find reasons to reject what we have seen? Some of the younger Kethmari in the crowd shouted their support for the cubs, but many of the older ones remained silent. Change was always difficult, especially when it challenged beliefs that had been held for thousands of years. War Chief Gorak stood up to speak. His huge form commanded respect from everyone in the room. I have fought in many battles, he said. I have seen warriors much larger than these cubs fail where they succeeded. What they did today was not luck. It was skill, intelligence, and courage working together. But they are still weak, protested Elder Thurok, one of the more traditional council members. What happens when they face enemies that cannot be outsmarted? What happens when brute strength is the only answer? Sarah could not stay quiet any longer. She stood up, her chains rattling. May I speak? Elder Korvash nodded. You started this, human. You may finish it. Sarah walked to the center of the hall. All eyes were on her small form. Elder Thurok asks what happens when strength is the only answer. But I ask you, when is that ever true? She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many Kethmari as possible. In all the time I have studied your people, I have learned about your greatest heroes. Yes, they were strong warriors. But what made them truly great was not their muscles. It was their ability to think, to adapt, and to find new solutions to old problems. Tell us about your own people, Elder Marana requested. How do humans handle those who are different? Sarah smiled sadly. We don't always handle it well, she admitted. For a long time, we made the same mistakes you are making now. We thought that people who looked different, or acted different, were somehow less valuable. And what changed? Asked Thaxul. He was holding his cubs in his arms as they slept peacefully against his chest. We learned that diversity makes us stronger, Sarah explained. Some of our greatest scientists were people who thought differently than everyone else. Some of our bravest soldiers were people others thought were too weak to fight. We discovered that when different types of people work together, they can solve problems that none of them could solve alone. She pointed to the 3 sleeping cubs. Zirak, Nissa, and Corvain just proved this today. They succeeded because they were different, not in spite of it. Their small size, their quick minds, their ability to work together, these are not weaknesses, they are gifts. Elder Korvash was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. What do you propose we do? We cannot simply ignore thousands of years of tradition. Don't ignore tradition, Sarah said. Improve it. Keep the parts that make you strong, but change the parts that make you weak. Instead of abandoning cubs who are different, study them. Learn from them. Find ways to use their unique abilities to help your people. The human speaks wisdom, said War Chief Gorak. In battle, I use many different types of warriors. Some are strong, some are fast, some are clever. Each one has value. Taxul stepped forward. I have been wrong, he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. I almost threw away the greatest treasures of my life because I was too blind to see their worth. These cubs are not mistakes, they are miracles. The debate continued late into the night. Some elders argued for maintaining the old ways, others called for change. But slowly, opinion began to shift. Finally, Elder Korvash called for a vote. All in favor of accepting the cubs as full members of Kethmari society? 7 hands went up. It was not everyone, but it was enough. All in favor of changing our laws to protect cubs who are born different? This time, 9 hands went up. Even some of the traditional elders agreed that the old laws needed to be reconsidered. And all in favor of releasing Dr. Sarah Chen and recognizing her as a friend of the Kethmari people? All 12 hands went up. Even the elders who disagreed with changing the laws admitted that Sarah had acted with honor and courage. The chains were removed from Sarah's wrists. She rubbed the sore spots where they had been and felt a huge weight lift from her shoulders. But the real celebration began when Thaxul officially claimed his cubs in front of the entire assembly. I present Zirak, Nissa, and Corvain Cubs of the Stormwind clan, children of my blood and my pride." The crowd cheered loudly. Many Kethmari came forward to touch the cubs gently and offer their congratulations. The cubs woke up and looked around in wonder at all the friendly faces surrounding them. Over the following months, things changed quickly in Kethmari society. The cubs became famous throughout the planet as the tiny heroes. Their success inspired other Kethmari to look more carefully at cubs who were born different. A new law was passed called the Second Chance Decree. Any cub who would have been abandoned under the old laws would instead be given special training to help them find their unique strengths. Sarah's research expanded beyond biology into cultural exchange programs. She worked with the Kethmari to set up schools where cubs of all sizes could learn together. The smaller cubs often became teachers for the larger ones, showing them new ways to solve problems. Zirak, Nissa, and Corvain grew into remarkable young adults. They never became as large as normal Kethmari, but they became something perhaps more valuable: bridges between their people and the wider galaxy. When they reached adulthood, they formed the first mixed-species military unit in Kethmari history. The Swift Claw Division combined human technology, Kethmari strength, and the cubs' unique abilities to create a force unlike any other. Sarah stood on the balcony of her new research facility, watching the three cubs training with both human and Kethmari soldiers in the courtyard below. They moved like dancers, their small forms flowing between their larger teammates in perfect coordination. Taxul joined her on the balcony. Over the past year, he had become not just a father to his cubs, but a true friend to Sarah. "Do you ever regret what you did?" he asked her. Sarah smiled as she watched Zarak teaching a group of human soldiers how to move more quietly, while Nissa showed Kethmari warriors a new way to climb steep walls. "Never," she said. "Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when we save the things that everyone else wants to throw away." "The cubs have a proposal for you," Thaxul said. "They want to join the next diplomatic mission to the outer colonies. They think their story could help other species learn to work together." "What do you think?" Sarah asked. Thaxul watched his cubs with pride shining in his eyes. "I think the galaxy is not ready for them, but I also think that is exactly why they need to go." As the red sun set over Velterran, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning. 3 tiny cubs had already changed an entire world. Now they were ready to change the galaxy. The lesson they carried with them was simple but powerful. Strength comes in many forms. Wisdom can be found in the smallest packages, and sometimes the things that make someone different are exactly the things that make them extraordinary. In the end, height truly didn't matter. What mattered was the size of one's heart, the strength of one's mind, and the courage to prove that even the smallest among us can cast the largest shadows.